A sequel is defined by dictionary.com as being a literary work, movie, or etc. that is complete in itself but continues the narrative of a preceding work. Some examples of this would be Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Mass Effect 2, and Captain America: The Winter Soldier. There can also be sequels to a sequel, leading to the creation of a trilogy or a series. Notable examples would be the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Twilight Saga, and the Legend of Zelda franchise. The Legend of Zelda is a particularly interesting one, as the continuity of the games is rather vague and rarely seems to line up with one another. Nobody compares the story of Twilight Princess to Skyward Sword, for example, or becomes irritated when the plots don't connect in a clear, concise way. Bioshock Infinite, released in 2013 under Irrational Games and 2K Studios, follows the story of Booker DeWitt, a former Pinkerton contractor who is sent to the floating city of Colombia with one goal: bring the girl named Elizabeth to New York and your debt will be wiped clean. While exploring the city, the two of you realize you're part of a bigger narrative than one would ever expect, as well as find yourselves pulled into a civil war you wanted no part in. While many players left satisfied with what happened in Bioshock Infinite, others were disappointed with the lack of a substantial connection to the franchise it's connected to, as well as issues with the narrative the gameplay portrays. It is hard not to assume the two games would be connected. They're part of the same franchise after all. Why wouldn't you compare the two? Find the direct connections to the plot. It's a sequel or a prequel, is it not? Bioshock Infinite and the franchise, in a sense, are their message. The games heavily discuss philosophical ideas, as well as how these ideas can lead to the collapse of a society. In this video, I will dissect what I mean when I say that this game is not a sequel, but rather a companion piece which only acquires the Bioshock brand to fit certain premises and themes into the overall narrative, while also defining what a Bioshock game really is. I'd like to quickly acknowledge Burial at Sea Part 1 and Part 2, as I know these games heavily connect Bioshock Infinite to the first game. While I love the DLC and think it does an amazing job tying these worlds together, this discussion is less so about how the DLC ties the story in, and how it could have never done so, and Bioshock Infinite would have still been able to fit in with the original franchise. While Bioshock Infinite shares a franchise name with the original Bioshock and Bioshock 2, it is hard not to notice the stark differences in the world, atmosphere, and general message. While the original Bioshock was about the individuality of man, free will with no law, and choices, Bioshock Infinite discusses nationalism and how it can lead to intense form of racism, as well as the many-world theory and lack of choices. Bioshock takes place in a dystopian society, a former utopia, where everyone is lawless and has become crazed due to plasmids and Eve. Everyone is out for themselves, and no one cares about who you are, only the resources you possess. Compare this to Bioshock Infinite, a current utopia which falls into dystopia before your very eyes, where looting is unnecessary and feels out of place. The enemies, which are policemen trying to protect their home and their land from you, are killed for little to no reason other than the fact that they're trying to kill you. This leads to a ludonarrative dissonance from Bioshock Infinite. The discussion of ludonarrative dissonance actually began with the first Bioshock, where Clint Hawking discussed how the gameplay of Bioshock did not connect to the story. When describing linearity, Gregory Costikyan states that, in other words, there's a direct, immediate conflict between the demands of a story and the demands of a game. Divergent from a story's path is likely to make for a less satisfying story. Restricting a player's freedom of action is likely to make for a less satisfying game. To a degree that you make a game more like a story, a controlled, predetermined experience, with events occurring as the author wishes, you make it a less effective game. To a degree that you make a story more like a game, with alternative paths and outcomes, you make it that a less effective story. It's not merely that games aren't stories and vice versa. Rather, they are in a sense opposites. This accurately describes ludonarrative dissonance, as it is the disconnect of a game's narrative and gameplay. When the two do not fit together, it causes issues for the player to connect the theme of the story to what is happening around them. This is Bioshock Infinite's biggest struggle, the divide between its gameplay and its message it's trying to send. It struggles to find a happy medium between achieving a cohesion with the message of nationalism and racism, but rather opts to return to what makes a Bioshock game Bioshock. This causes the player to feel confused with the gameplay, not understanding how it works in this world and why they must mow down everyone around them. Extra Credits highlights this issue in their video in service to the brand, Why Bioshock Infinite Failed. They explain the aforementioned gameplay issue while also outlining issues with the vigor system and looting everything in sight.
Obviously, these were meant to be a surrogate for plasmids, but where plasmids were endogenous to the world of Rapture, vigors just make no sense in Colombia. On a most literal level, the original Bioshock was all about the effect of plasmids on society. We could see what giving near-magical powers to the people of Rapture did to that place. Plasmids were a cool gameplay mechanic, yes, but a great deal of effort was made to make sure that they were a gameplay mechanic which made the world more real and more alive. With vigors, the opposite is true. Throughout the game, you see people doing tasks that would clearly be much easier with vigors, but why aren't they using them? Why isn't anybody using them except for the crazy pyros and crow guys? It can't be because they're too expensive, because at the very beginning we see they're cheap enough to give away at the county fair. Why aren't they given to the police who are dying by the truckload trying to stop you? Why hasn't the creation of magical powers in a bottle had any impact on the society in this otherwise well-crafted world? It's because vigors were shoehorned in service of the brand. Someone, somewhere in the design process, thought that you can't have Bioshock without plasmids because that's what Bioshock's all about.
They describe how since it's a Bioshock game, the game needs looting and fun powers, when in reality, the game would be stronger without them. Definitely recommend checking out their video, link in the description. So it's a Bioshock game more in the name slapped on the box rather than any relation to the gameplay and themes. That's the point of this essay, right? I'm here to shit all over Bioshock Infinite and kill your crops. Wrong. I believe that a Bioshock game is not defined by its gameplay, nor its looting mechanics or fun, awesome powers. Rather, I believe what defines a Bioshock game is the discussion of philosophy and the collapse of societies these games have created. Take Rapture, for instance. A Randian society built on the idea of a man's free will as well as the ability to do what you wish with no laws or consequences.
I am Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone. I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different. I chose the impossible. I chose rapture. Where the artist would not fear the censor, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small. And with the sweat of your brow, rapture can become your city as well.
Then there's Colombia, a city up in the clouds to be closer to God, filled with nationalism, which leads to its racist ideals.
3, 2, 1. Attention! Attention!
Alright, we're just stay calm.
5,000 feet. 10,000 feet. 15,000 feet. Hallelujah.
Both cities are based on philosophical ideas which make up their basic philosophies in existence. Both games discuss these philosophies and dissect why a society based around them would ultimately collapse. While Rapture has already collapsed when you arrive and you're examining the aftermath of how power and greed collapse this underwater utopia, Colombia is at its peak, its Independence Day. You, more so in an indirect way, caused the downfall by bringing harsh issues of racism, slavery, and religion to light. In addition, these games heavily discuss choice and free will. It is a major theme in Bioshock due to it being one of the pillars which Rapture was built upon. The game leads you to believe that you're making your own choices only to rip those away in one scene. Yet the few choices you have control over give you your own unique ending. Bioshock Infinite looks at choice differently. The player receives small, non-consequential choices in the long run. The game, while heavily rooted in discussion about racism, religion, and nationalism, also commentates about free will and choice. The plot of the game revolves around saving a girl from a tower which she was trapped in, yet over and over again it seems as though you are both trapped. Any choices you have made don't affect where you end up or how the story ends. The game is commentating on our place in the universe, how our choices impact the world. More specifically, in the long scheme of things, do our choices matter?
There are loved ones in the glory whose dear forms.
The Bioshock franchise is not defined by its gunplay, nor the ability to have the player shoot bees or crows out of their hand. What defines the series at its core is its ability to have a philosophical discussion with the player about whether or not their choices or actions even matter in the multitude of universes and timelines we face. This is why Bioshock Infinite doesn't have to be a direct continuity with the original game. It can stand on its own 2 feet as a testament to the free will of man without having to steal aspects from the original just to have them. It doesn't matter that Bioshock has plasmids and gunplay. Bioshock Infinite is a member of the Bioshock brand without these, just by having a conversation.
In the sky.